Stories of Transformation, an NRCDV radio podcast production. Recently, NRCDV released Serving Male Identified Survivors of Intimate Partner Violence, a new technical assistance guidance. While data continues to show that girls and women are disproportionately impacted by intimate partner violence, boys and men are also victims and deserve survivor-centered and holistic services. I am Yvonne Ortiz, and today I will be speaking with Eric Stiles, independent contractor providing training and technical assistance to the field. We will have a candid conversation on how to enhance capacity to meet the needs of all victims, and will offer guideposts to inclusive practices for responding to the needs of male-identified victims of intimate partner violence.
Welcome, Eric. Thanks for joining us. I had the privilege of working with you on several occasions on projects that focus on male victimization, specifically domestic violence. And let me tell you, to our listeners, it was truly a big challenge at the beginning as an advocate, and mainly because, historically, domestic violence programs were born from the women's liberation movement to address the needs of female survivors who still today continue to represent the majority of victims seeking services. So the idea for us, advocates that a man can be victimized and it's in need of supportive services can present a philosophical challenge. And Eric, we lived through this together. So my question to you is, how can we begin to shift our thinking in order to adapt survivor-centered mentality?
I think, first off, thank you for having me. And the ways to shift away from this one way of thinking about how we serve victims and who is a victim is going back to our grassroots, and that is having more open dialogue, more conversations, and going into rooms and spaces and looking at the room no longer as there are women in this room who have been victims, and then there are men in the room who are possible offenders, but also expanding that to people in this room, both male, female, and trans folk, that have all been victims of domestic violence and sexual violence and other forms of violence. And there are also possible those who have offended in this room from all of those gender identities. And really expanding our way of communicating and taking steps back and pausing when we start using gendered language, and start being gender inclusive and start asking questions of ourselves of where does this come from, and start really having that open dialogue and communication. But to support all that, we really need to start healing some of the wounds that we carry around because of the work we do or previous wounds. If you hear the story over and over again where one person or one group of people is constantly the aggressors, it's really hard to switch now and view them as a person who needs your support. So we need to kind of work on that trauma that induces in ourselves as workers. We ask a lot of our advocates. They work very long hours. They take very difficult calls, and they use they use a lot of their emotional range to meet the needs of survivors. And when you're kind of using the same pattern over and over again, it causes some trauma. So find support and counseling for yourself. So our agency needs to provide that support to us as advocates and to our staff and to the agencies. And it needs to be responsive after major crimes. There are so many times you can't pick up a paper without hearing about a domestic violence victim being murdered. And that causes trauma to our agency, and it causes trauma to ourselves individually. So we need to find support for that and move forward, and then have these open dialogues and conversations.
And I think that's what helped me at the beginning, years ago, when we started working together. It was just having that dialogue. Remember that we've served males, we've served children in our programs, and, go through all those challenges that we have and have a conversation, this shift of thinking that males cannot be victims, only aggressors. And that's something that our society ingrains in us. And it's really hard for our society to accept male victimization. And Eric, what are some of the characteristics associated with being a man, what we see that being a man, looks like?
Characteristics associated with that being a man in rabbit ears, little parentheses, usually is that you don't show emotions, that when you have a problem that faces you, you deal with it yourself, and if you don't deal with it yourself, you are now a traitor to your gender, and it somehow makes you less than. And thirdly, that this cannot happen to me. I'm supposed to be the one who's in control of all of my circumstances. So those three things, just those, really inhibit men from being able to communicate about their emotions, to communicate about the victimization they have endured, and to really recognize it as being victimization. And then the responses to being victimized often get more complicated because if you don't have any range to deal with them, if you don't have any range to talk about it, then now what do you do with that? So your victimization now gets compounded.
So talking about our programs, what are some of the barriers to help seeking that male survivors have expressed, you have shared with you?
Some of the barriers that programs, first off, have. I want to state that it's no program's fault that these barriers are there. A lot of these barriers have been inherited. A lot of these barriers are created by the culture and communities that we live in, and we are a part of them. We are not separate. We are the part of the community that we live in, the people that we serve. So when I say there's barriers, I don't want this to feel like there's an attack on any agency, because it's not. It's just some things that when you become aware, you can now change and support more. And it's not unlike the idea of wheelchair ramps. Often back in the day when I was growing up, there wasn't a wheelchair ramp for people to make it into buildings. And then we realized that we need to have those to enable access to everyone. This is no different. We have to think of it the same way as access. One of the first access points is just the recognition that this agency serves me. And so often, the naming of an agency has a very gendered name. And with that gendered name, if it's a men's center, women don't feel like they can go there. Conversely, if it's a women's center, men don't feel like they can go there. Also, it's the idea that our communities and our culture really has not opened the door wide enough for men to recognize what domestic violence looks like for them and that it is domestic violence. And so often, there's these internet videos happening now where they show a video of a female, for example, hitting a male over and over and over again, and they've videotaped it, and there's usually a crowd around, and you hear all these jeers about the man being a punk and the man just putting up with it. Oh, you should hit her. And so often those video clips stop, and then they have all these comments coming in about, oh, you should punch her, you should do this. But no one's talking about that's a domestic violence relationship. So you can't recognize it if it now becomes a matter of manliness. So really recognizing what domestic violence is for men. They can't identify it. Now add in some of the other concerns that domestic violence survivors often feel trapped in, and that is losing the ability to see your children or losing your children. If you're a man and you have a child or children in a relationship and you're experiencing domestic violence, whether it be from your female partner or male partner, the fear of losing one's children keeps them from coming in. Because to admit there's a problem going on in the house, the first thought is someone's going to come and take my children. Conversely, not knowing what support even is. You ask people on the street what an advocate is. People really can't give you a definition of what an advocate is or what they do. If you say it's domestic violence advocate, they say, oh, they help battered women, or they help those women from Lifetime Channel. There's a very specific cultural context for what domestic violence advocate is, and it's always focused towards women. So not knowing that there is support and one advocate does and what they can do is very problematic. And then the responses from other systems, law enforcement or medical personnel, and how their systems also need to grow. So if you call the law enforcement, and I've worked with many survivors who've actually called, and the law enforcement will come out, and especially in same-sex partners, and say to the men, if I have to come out here again, I'm going to arrest both of you. Mm-hmm. So there is this automatic shutdown. Your problem is not our problem, and you're both men. You should fight it out. And I also hear that with women who are in same-sex partners. If it's men calling about their wives, why are you calling? Can't you handle your wife? Yes. It's that kind of context back. And then medical personnel, it's really humiliating for anyone. And humiliation is just a small word that I can't even wrap my mind around all the words that happens or emotions that happen for a survivor. To say this bruise is caused by someone who's supposed to love me. This violence is caused by someone who's loved me or I love. That right there stops people from talking to medical personnel. So you tell them you fell at work. You have all these other reasoning why you are now physically hurt. Those are some of the barriers that keep people from coming in for services.
Yeah, we all know, and we hear this, that, we know as advocates that one size does not fit all, especially when we're talking about different cultures, different communities. So same when serving males. And tell us in which ways working with male survivors may differ significantly from working with female survivors.
A couple of the ways it may differ significantly is that we have grown into a movement of victim service providers where we've become very passive. We wait for the victims to come to us, to come to our doors, to seek out the services. We have to be more active in the community and actually go to where men are. Other systems they might be trapped up in. So often a coping mechanism for if you're experiencing domestic violence is use of drugs or alcohol to numb the pain or escape the pain or to alter your experience. We need to go there to talk to individuals and to talk to men and provide services there. It's much safer to kind of duck and cover in a drug and alcohol program, seeing a domestic violence advocate, than it is to cross town and now go to a domestic violence shelter. So providing services out in the community is a difference. Also, the way we communicate about our services. So often, we as advocates have grown to understand that everybody will come to group because it's a group to talk about what you've experienced. Often, men, especially men of color or marginalized groups, the idea of going into a 1 hour or 90-minute, once-a-week conversation with complete strangers about how you experience domestic violence is just something that's not going to happen for you. You don't find that safe. You have cultural context that's layered into it of being not manly enough. So the idea that we have this group and we say no one comes, well, they don't come because it's not suited for them. Instead, we need to change the group to things that men will actually come for and take away the domestic violence stigmatization. Other ways of differences are really looking at, when we provide services, what the response of those we're serving is. If you have a person responding where they're raising their voice and they're angry over their experience, it doesn't mean they're angry at you. So our services need to be a little bit more flexible and take that into account. Or they need to be more adapted to cultural needs. I did and provide a lot of services while eating food with people. Or fake eating food because you just can't eat anything at the time. But having the services adapt. Are some differences.
Mm-hmm. There's some difference. You mentioned that some of the male survivors don't identify their experiences of domestic violence. And when we are talking about public awareness, how can we be able to reach out to them? How can we change our campaigns, our awareness efforts?
I honestly want to put out there to the world that I am not the expert and I don't know everything. My inkling and what my gut says, if I'm working in the field for a long time, is that we need to take domestic violence and express it as family violence or express it as, I'm not trying to generalize the term away, but we do know by working with domestic violence survivors who are women, we start taking on the role of what's the experience for children who witness it. So we've expanded our view of the whole family unit. So we need to expand the whole way we look at domestic violence in that sense and look at it as a little bit broader and make our campaigns around that and less focused on one group or one gendered group, because so much of that has left out many people of color, many different cultures, and many different types of families. If you have two dads and there's domestic violence, it doesn't fit in the model we have right now of our prevention campaigns. So really talking about the violence that happens within those relationships, the violence that occurs within dating in that sense. Teen dating violence has an opportunity to really expand in that direction, and I'm really excited because often younger men are seeing themselves in that, but there still is question of, wait, is this really for me? Because everything's about women on your website. So really expanding it, I think, is an inkling to how we can shift our campaigns, but being very mindful about the imagery we use. We are a part of the system in the world that we live in. If you go online and try and gather up images for individuals, the majority of them are white to start off with. And if you start talking about domestic violence and start putting in some search words, it's mostly white women. So really you have to start shifting our imagery, shifting the way we talk about it, and really talk about the whole community, the whole populace that we work with.
I remember that we went together and we did several focus groups around the country and the U.S. territories also. And one of the questions that we always got from advocates were regarding safe shelter. That's a big one. And so talking about safe shelter, residential services, you know, and we all know that shelter programs have been historically gender-specific for women and their children. And in some areas, they're being creative and they're trying to provide safe shelter for men also. But how can a safe shelter provide the safe housing to a male survivor in a way that he feels like he's safe?
I think it means more work on our part. So just like we have externalized kind of marketing and shifting our materials, we have to do that internally when we have a shelter program. So really talking within the shelter of how we keep everybody safe in that shelter, no matter their gender identity, so that the other residents feel like, hey, everybody's here and we're okay. When we provide that shelter to men, often there's the idea of the bathroom comes up, the bathroom issue, and I kind of equate that to, at home, does everybody go to the bathroom at the same time? No, you take turns. So really, common sense things, but they need to be talked about, and you need to talk about with your employees. And then the idea of what does that shelter look like? Because gender-specific shelters were born historically, and we have to be very, very aware that there have been numerous attempts of those who have offended, being male, coming to a shelter and trying to attack the woman who's in the shelter. Same thing can happen towards a male who you have sheltered. It's much easier to look for one type of person out the door to make sure no one can come. When you start inviting men into your shelter, now it becomes even more confusing. But there are some practices that shelters have started using that work very well. They have pictures. They talk about safety. They talk about the process. It's a matter of educating individuals. Because putting men into, for example, a hotel, I've heard, we'll put them up in a hotel, puts them at higher risk. It puts them at higher risk for their offender to find them. It puts them at higher risk for if they have negative coping skills. It puts them at risk for harming themselves because now they're just isolated out in a hotel room or a motel room that's the cheapest that the shelter can pay for, and they are now struggling by themselves without services, meaning someone to talk to, someone to really give them that human connection, say, you're real, we accept you, we love you, and what's happened to you is not your fault. And that's what shelter staff give those who come in, and we need to provide that for men. So how we provide that is going back to our basics, but we need all those conversations in the shelter first.
Mm-hmm. That is the truth. So, Eric, in closing, what else can we do to help our society understand that although women are disproportionately impacted by intimate partner violence, but boys and men are also victims and should be treated with kindness and compassion?
I think one thing that we didn't touch upon in this is a deeper understanding of those who offend and those who do commit domestic violence. Those who offend. A deeper understanding, more conversations about that, less creating. My grandmother used to say that you can't make a boogeyman because then you won't be scared of things you need to be scared of. And she would say it to me because, growing up, I'd be like, oh, I'm scared of the dark or scared of this. And she's like, you can't do that because there's other things in the world that you really need to be afraid of. So having that conversation about who is it that offends, and across the whole spectrum, why would a young woman offend who's in an early relationship? Why would a young man offend? Why would a person in a trans relationship offend? What are the reasons that lead people? And really opening up those who offend and those who are victims, and real conversations without summarizing it down to a sentence or two, without making it sound like it's so easy just to say, this is not acceptable, no, we're not going to have it no more. I'm not ripping apart any campaign, but that's part of it, having a campaign, but we need to have these broader conversations, and we need to get people out there who are talking about the subject matter in broader conversations. Our communities are wounded. Our world is a wounded world. We live in it. We swim in it. So really start looking at that, our communities in that way. We start thinking about how can we heal it. And one way of healing it is demystifying it, demystifying what advocates are, demystifying what people feel the prejudice of an advocate might be, that they only serve women, really putting that out there, really elevating now our field, our work, and how we see people as whole people. And that it's not this either or, on-off switch, this binary that has been created, but more expansive. And I think that is going to be very beneficial. And the very, very last thing I want to say about that is we need to have this conversation in more than just English. We need to have it in many different cultures and many different groups. Our country's not made up of just one. And yes, I can talk about my experiences and where I've worked, but we need these other conversations because other communities and other cultures and other ethnicities and other orientations have answers waiting for us. They have answers waiting for us in how to do this work and how to support and love each other. And having them into it and not be an add-on, not be, here's the way we did it with white, and here's the add-on group. So really making it expansive. It sounds like a lot of work, but it's really not. We're all busy people, and we're chasing and doing a lot of work, but these conversations are where our movement started, and we need to get back to it.
Thank you so much, Eric. Truly, this is just, a 5 minute that we had a conversation here. But if you guys, our listeners, want to learn more, Eric just authored technical assistance guidance for us, the NRCDV, alongside Casey King, Director of Programs and Prevention, and myself. So if you want to learn more, this document is available for you through Vonnet. Go read it, leave comments, ask questions. We are still working. We're still trying to make service accessible for everybody, not just for women and children. So thank you, Eric, and we'll continue the conversation later.
Thank you. Bye.
You just listened to Stories of Transformation, a NRCDV radio podcast production. Thank you to my guest Eric Stiles for sharing his expertise today. You can hear our other podcasts and access additional resources on gender-based violence and related topics at nrcdv.org. NRCDV radio podcasts are brought to you by the National Resource Center on Domestic Violence and supported by the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services, Administration for Children and Families, Family and Youth Services Bureau.